We are back, and we are joined now by Samantha Simon, assistant professor in the School of Sociology and School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona, author of her recent book, Before the Badge: How Academy Training Shapes Police Violence. Samantha, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Of course. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So your research took multiple years. You embedded yourself and studied these 4 large municipal police departments in the South, all cities, right? Mid to larger cities in the same state in the South, which is pretty specific. I mean, can you explain a little bit more about your methodology and why you chose to confine it to just one state and also to urban areas as well?
Sure. So my general research method is ethnographic, which means that, kind of as you alluded to, I embed myself as much as possible, as close as possible to the social phenomena that I'm interested in studying. So what that means, though, is that one person cannot be everywhere. You do have to make methodological choices about what places you're going to study. So I did limit it to one state. Some of the reasons for that. One primary reason was that states do have specific mandated training for the academies in that state. So I did want that to be consistent. But I did want to introduce some variation across the academies in important ways. So, for example, these cities varied across demographic compositions. So the departments did as well. And they differed kind of significantly in the political context of the individual cities. So those are a couple ways that they varied, also in size to some degree. So I was hopeful. I was curious if I might find some variation across these academies, even in the same state context. But to my surprise, I did not find very much variation in the findings that I ultimately had.
Yeah, and your findings are very, I mean, it just makes so clear how this bad apples myth, and I know you addressed that directly, but like this is something repeated by many politicians, including Democratic ones, about how there are just a few bad apples on police forces and you gotta punish them and weed them out, where, your work just paints an entirely different picture of police training. Can you explain why that myth is persistent and why it's not necessarily something that jives with the reporting that you did here?
Yeah, of course. I completely understand why bad apple arguments are sort of an appealing, attractive explanation for many of our different social problems that we have in the United States. It's an easier solution. So if there are just individual sort of egregiously violent, egregiously racist officers with, bad intentions for getting into policing in the first place, if we can just simply detect them, pull them out of the occupation, then problem solved, right? So it's a very appealing explanation for this really deeply rooted problem. What I found, after spending a year at these police academies, was that this is a much bigger problem than simply, identifying and removing individual officers. This is not an individual problem. This is an organizational process that takes place that selects and then socializes new officers into a worldview and a way of physically moving throughout the world that emphasizes danger, threat, suspicion, and ultimately really requires the use of violence. So this is a socialization, this is an organizational problem that would need to be addressed rather than, an individual level issue.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that constant reinforcement of the danger in the world. Can you give our audience some examples of how that was a significant through line in all 4 academies that you studied?
Yeah, definitely. So that emphasis on violence, that emphasis on escalating violence, really, like there was a sense that there was an intensifying war on cops, that, the risk that officers were taking on as part of their jobs was getting worse. This was communicated in many ways at these academies. So, for example, at all of the academies I, spent time at, they would often show really graphic videos repeatedly of officers being either, brutally beaten or killed while on duty. And these were real videos, of course. These were real incidents that had happened. These were real people. These were officers who had been killed. But the takeaway message really like over and over again and showing these videos was that, at any turn, at any moment, this could be their fate as well if they did not, maintain their vigilance and stay constantly prepared for violence. This was also really hammered home through different sorts of exercises. So, for example, at one academy, the cadets, after having gone through sort of a tactical exercise or exam where they had to demonstrate different competencies in tactics, those cadets who had their gun taken away during one of these exercises by their instructors were then required to write their own obituary that night and bring it back the next day. So these were, really, it showed up in many different ways throughout the training, but was really emphasized by these trainers that if these cadets did not heed their warnings, if they did not train, that this could, ultimately be how they die.
It's not commensurate with the reality of the situation. I mean, I'm just looking at some of the fatality injury rates for different professions in this country: logging workers, people that work on airplanes, roofers, garbage collectors, delivery drivers, farmers, agricultural workers, crane operators, construction, highway maintenance, people who work on cement. I mean, these are all mechanics, small engine mechanics. These are all professions that have a higher fatality rate or fatal injury rate, I should say, than that of police officers. But that doesn't seem to penetrate there, because it seems like they're purposefully kind of re-traumatizing themselves to get into a specific mentality.
Yeah. And I think it is true. I just want to acknowledge that there is sort of a different, it's a different thing to die in a logging accident than to be killed by another person.
Right.
So I do recognize that there's sort of a difference in that fear or that experience for officers. But it is true, like empirically, policing has not gotten more dangerous. And I think that's really an important point to emphasize, that despite this narrative of there being a war on cops, there really is no empirical evidence to support that narrative. Policing has not consistently over time gotten more dangerous. There's, of course, sometimes a peak year, but over time, it's just not true. And kind of what you allude to, like there are other risks to police officers that are actually, more relevant, like wearing their seatbelts. For example, officers often don't wear their seatbelts and, will die in car accidents at higher rates than they are, being killed. But that's not really discussed, of course, as a real or pressing threat in these academy settings. It's certainly not in the way that, violence is.
Yeah, it returns to that kind of reinforcement of danger there. And your point about how policing has not actually gotten more dangerous is an important one, because you also write about how in these academies there's often discussion of how it's never been harder to be a police officer. Can you talk a bit about that and how, that fits into the culture around policing within the context of the Black Lives Matter protests?
Yeah. So this was a sentiment that I heard, throughout these academies throughout that year, that, policing, that we were in a political moment that was so intense, that was so divisive, and that was targeting officers. So, for example, I remember one conversation I had with a corporal at one of the academies where he was telling me, that it was harder than ever, that it was more dangerous than ever to be a police officer, that he would never allow his child to be one, though, in fact, his son was applying to be a police officer at that time. And I sort of asked him, well, what period of time are you comparing this to? And in terms of, resentment towards the police, there have certainly been periods throughout, history in his own life, frankly, where that has been true. And his sense of this, his response was that, well, in the 60s and 70s, for example, that was a movement. That was the civil rights movement. Now it's not a movement, was his, perspective on this, but rather it was a targeting of officers, that people were out there specifically just hateful of officers and targeting them, tracking them down to ambush them and kill them. So there was this idea for him and for other officers as well that the political context was different, that the Black Lives Matter movement was, in fact, not necessarily a movement, not in the same way that they perceived the civil rights movement, in hindsight, to have legitimacy. And really, in general, had throughout the academy training, trainers really just were quite dismissive of any of the arguments made by any kind of activists, frankly.
It's something that is persistent, I think, in my profession and covering these kinds of things, where you see how people are able to compartmentalize history once it's settled, as opposed to recognizing a continuation of dynamics in the present. And when you're a cop, I mean, that's an even more of an uphill battle, honestly, for that very reason, because it's a challenge to your identity and your professionalism in that way, to look inward. What also struck me about your book was how it doesn't just replicate some, violence and fear and police training and racism, but how people who were outside of a very specific, traditionally white masculine mode of policing, or who they were kind of shunned out of the way and weren't necessarily welcomed into the fold. Can you speak a bit about, there was one, I think it was Adam, who he's referred to in the book, one person who was mocked for not necessarily being as strong as some of the other people in the academy, and how did that kind of shake out?
Yeah. So I write about that in the last chapter of the book, just kind of who makes it to graduation. What kinds of cadets, what kinds of these new officers are considered a good fit for this institution, and why. So Adam is an example that I use to really illustrate this point, because, in many ways, Adam would be considered sort of a traditionally ideal conception of what a police officer is. He's kind of tall, he's like 6 feet tall, he's white, he's a man, he's from the South. And he was really, really excited to be a police officer. He really wanted to be a police officer. But he was not particularly strong. He didn't do particularly well in defensive tactics or in the physical fitness training. And he also, got a lot of flack from his trainers for using sort of an expansive vocabulary. One of his, trainers complained to me that, he was not an author, that he should be writing the way that the newspaper reads. So there were a lot of complaints about this. Trainers just really relentlessly mocked him, and a few other cadets that were, really targeted throughout the academy, both to his face and, behind his back. The other cadets knew about it. They talked to me about it. It came up in interviews with other, cadets, that there were definitely, cadets in the class that the trainers would kind of pit against each other. So yeah, he really didn't, in some ways he fit the mold, in other ways he really didn't. And in particular, just his sort of inability to physically fight in the way that the academy trainers wanted him to, really put a target on his back. He made it pretty far. He made it almost to the end. And throughout the academy, as I watched, I continually heard trainers talk about, we want to fire him, we need to fire him. We're essentially just creating enough of a paper trail to be able to do this. And typically what would happen is, the command staff would bring a cadet into the office. Of course, I was not able to watch this part. But what was told to me afterwards was that the cadets were usually given the option to resign or be fired. And the reason for them usually choosing to resign is that then they could at least continue to apply to other departments in the state. So while on paper, Adam was not technically fired or terminated, he essentially was forced to resign.
And this was reflected as well in people who were applying to policing, if they were women or people of color or women of color. Is that your assessment?
I mean, my assessment there is that cadets who are not straight, white, masculine men certainly have a different experience in the academy, and they have a more complicated and tougher time fitting into the overall narrative of the institution, which, really is one where masculine, straight, white men are protecting vulnerable people from bad guys. Each of these roles is deeply gendered and racialized, right?
I'm sorry to butt in, but that patriarchal notion I think is really under discussed, and it's great that you highlight it because it also feeds into some of the racist tropes that also are prevalent and like the coded language, speaking about parts of the city where Black and Latino people lived, and the perception that these white kind of heteronormative cops have about being the great protectors. It's you can see who they might think they're protecting people from.
Yeah. I mean, one striking example I think about a lot, just in terms of it being quite symbolic, I suppose, is one of the sergeants at an academy that I went to had this small sort of like tchotchke statue, maybe 6 inches tall, in his office, of an officer like holding a woman while the officer had like wings on.
Yeah.
So really these like hero complexes are quite prominent. And that what that means for people who are not, again, straight, masculine, white men, is that they have trouble fitting somewhere into this narrative as the hero, as the protector. If they're supposed to either be the bad guy or the vulnerable and the innocent and the weak, then they have a lot of trouble kind of figuring out where they stand within the organization. However, that does not mean that women don't make it in, that they don't succeed, that they don't graduate, and same with people of color. They do. And part of my argument in this book actually is really challenging demographic diversity reform efforts as they are currently conceptualized as sort of a fix-all for policing, in that this process of selection and socialization means that whoever makes it in and then makes it through to graduation aligns themselves, very heavily, very strongly with the existing institution.
And that institution replicates many of the things that we've talked about, but also this, you talk about the socialization of state violence through something like one of the planks being an us versus them mentality. How did that show itself in your research?
Yeah, so I write about that in one of the chapters, and I originally had titled it Us versus Thems because there are a lot of groups that kind of represent, I separate them out into institutional threats or physical threats, real or imagined, to the policing organization or to police officers themselves. So for example, you would probably be one of these threats as a source of media, particularly
a leftist, a dirty hippie.
Exactly. Yeah. So you would present an institutional threat to the police. They're quite wary of media in general. Not all, though. Fox News was often on in the break rooms in the back, and the recruiting officers' offices. So certainly not all media, but that was one. Activist groups, particularly leftist activist groups. So they weren't just taking aim, for example, I guess literally or figuratively at Black Lives Matter, but they also had issues with, Occupy movements, for example. Show, video footage of that, of officers, spraying a crowd from an Occupy protest or demonstration with, OC spray or some version of that. And one training officer referenced this as watering the hippies during a class. So those were, two certainly groups that presented an institutional threat to officers. And the trainers would often tell cadets to make sure that if there was an activist trying to kind of push them into a reaction on camera, to not give in to that, and that they were simply trying to, push officers into a reaction to then further their own cause. They also had, again, we talked a little bit about this, but a sense that there were evil people out there wanting to and engaging in ambushes of the police. This does happen sometimes. However, not very often. It's really rare for an actual ambush of police officers, a fatal ambush, to happen. When they do happen, however, they are very, very meaningful for officers. This occurred when I was at these academies. I think it was in New Jersey at the time, which was not the state that I was in, was quite far from the state that I was in. And that instance had a huge effect on sort of the mental state of the officers that I was around in terms of intensifying their fears and their suspicion of others. So there were a lot of these groups, and part of this process of being socialized into state violence for these cadets was learning, who are these outgroups? Who are these threats? How do I identify them? And then, as a result, their world becomes quite small. The people who they can trust, who are considered in-group, who are considered safe, becomes really just first responders, to be honest. And that becomes their new, social world and position in the broader world.
It's just very, very distinct from what the stated purpose of police is, which is protect and serve, versus we are warriors beating back the hordes of leftists and black people or Latino people, essentially. That seems very different from the mindset that is portrayed, that reinforces the bad apples myth. Like, to make it through this police academy, you kind of have to buy in, as you write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally think that's true. I think in order to make it to graduation, you absolutely have to. You have to demonstrate to the officers. There's these, formal requirements, of course. You have to pass the tests. You have to show up.
Right.
You have to follow sort of a litany of rules. But you also do have to show that you're a cultural fit for the institution, that you can move through the world looking like, sounding like, acting like a police officer. And really what I argue in the book is that a lot of that hinges on violence, engaging in it, being willing, arguably, I say eager, to engage violence, particularly when it's brought to you. I would definitely agree on that.
Well, the book is great. It's called Before the Badge: How Academy Training Shapes Police Violence. We will put a link to the book in the description wherever people are listening to this or watching it, and at majority.fm. Samantha, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much.